goodness and graciousness to us. Father, we thank you for the gift of salvation that we have through the blood of Jesus Christ. God, we ask that you'd help us to live life that shows our gratitude for all that you've done, and even now, Father, forgiveness of sins. Father, I ask that you'd help the time that we take today to be beneficial and profitable for us. God, that it be pleasing to you. Help us to learn more about who you are, what you expect of us, and Father, how we can put our trust in your word, that it is the message that you have for us today. Father, we ask all this in your name, amen. All right. Before I get started, I've got 3 more copies of the student guide that came in. If anybody wants one, you can raise your hand or just let me know and I'll get that to you if anybody needs one, wants one. The Unit 13 student guide. If you have that and worked with that this week, great. You're a week ahead because I'm not going to touch it this week. We're going to do something a little bit different. Something I was playing around with, was thinking about, thought maybe, well, I'll do it next week. And then we have a first time in however many years we've been doing this Answers in Genesis. We are a week ahead of the Munchkins for a change, instead of them being a week or 2 ahead of us. And so what I thought about doing next week, we're going to do now. And that'll put us right back on schedule. We'll both start the new unit at the same time next week. I was telling Pastor, he asked if but okay, slides aren't up. Is there a problem? I said, well, the slides aren't up because I didn't put them up. No slides today. You don't have to worry about that. The way I described it to him, we started out this series back in Unit 1, Lesson 1, and we had a time where we studied the Bible for a couple of weeks, and then about, 4.5 years in creation. At least that's what it felt like when we were going through, right? Looking at every detail and really tearing it apart and digging into it. Now we move from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and there is no introduction to the New Testament. It just jumps right in. The Messiah is come. That's the lesson. But there's a lot that happens to lay the groundwork for the Messiah coming. And so we're going to take some time and look at that today. And so rather than having my notes are on my little digital copy today. And we'll run through this quickly. Basically, an introduction to the New Testament. And there's a lot there. Let me find the verse I want to go to. Go to Galatians. That's where we'll start. And it's a verse that carries a lot of meaning in it, but it shows a lot of meaning as to how God works, too. Let's see here. Where do I want to land? Go to Galatians 4:4. Galatians 4, verse 4. Paul's writing, and he's giving some explanation about grace and the law and the relationship there. And in verse 4 of chapter 4, Paul says, but when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law. Verse 5 says, why? To redeem them that were under the law. But as we get started, I want to look at the first part of verse 4. But when the fullness of the time was come, what does that mean? Keeping in mind, when we read in the Gospels, we get to the end of the Gospels, particularly the end of the book of John, the resurrection has taken place. Jesus has met with the apostles, then has gone. And the apostles are all like distraught. What are we going to do? They decide, well, you know what? Let's do what we always do. Let's go fishing. And there they meet Jesus again. And then you have the discourse, the dialogue between Jesus and Peter. And in the midst of that, you get the impression that Peter really thinks that the end time, the return of Christ, is going to be during his lifetime. And he's all concerned about that. Let's take that now and think from where we are here in 2021. When is Christ going to return with the second coming? Peter thought it was during his lifetime. We are now 2,000 years later, give or take, right? And how many people since then, until now, were convinced it was going to be during their lifetime? And how many of us look at the world around us and say, it's going to be during our lifetime? And indeed, it may very well be yet today before services are done. We talk about the imminent return of Christ. But this phrase here, looking at the first coming of Christ, when the fullness of the time was come. What does it mean? When God was completely ready, he sent his son. So when's his son going to come back for the second coming? When God is ready. Not when we think it should happen, not when Peter thought it should happen, but when God says it's time. Well, what is it that set the stage then so that the fullness of time was come? And that's what I want to look at today, an introduction to the New Testament. Because Pastor talked 2 weeks ago, I think it was, on those 400 silent years. Last year was kind of an Old Testament review. Why do we have only 39 books? And what's the point of the 39 books? And what's the message, singular, of the 39 books? But to really understand the New Testament as we go into it, there's some historical background that we need to be familiar with. And it's important. And I alluded to part of it last week. You travel around the world today, how many different languages are there? You study Wycliffe Bible translators, and there's another Bible translation group that just slipped my mind, but they're working to get the Bible. They still don't have the Bible into every known language on the planet, which is kind of befuddling because you'd think with technology solves everything, right? I mean, you would think, how hard can it be? Obviously, it's more difficult than my layman's mind might understand. And yet, there is a common language, a trade language throughout the world, and we're speaking it right now, English. A large percentage of the population of the world has at least a rudimentary understanding of English. They may not be completely conversant, but they know enough to be dangerous, right? They know enough to be able to get a point across. It may be broken English. They would not speak the King's English, neither do we. But they speak enough to get their message across or to understand the message. They get bits and pieces. They had that and even better as the New Testament starts. And again, I alluded to it last week. Pastor may have mentioned it a little bit the week before. You have Alexander the Great, who establishes a world empire. Now, understanding world empires is always more fun when you have a globe, because you see these great world empires that cover that much of the globe, right? The Greek Empire, how much did it really cover? And you look and say, it didn't cover Asia, so it didn't cover much. It didn't cover Africa, so it didn't cover much. And we know that the Greek Empire did not cover North and South America, didn't cross the ocean. And yet this was a world empire, right? And yet most of the major events in world history during that time frame were taking place in the area covered by the Greek Empire. And while the Greek Empire wasn't incredibly huge, and nor did it last a really, really long time, it had a lasting impact in culture, in language, even to a degree in government. And it had an impact in religion, though not maybe as great as the Roman Empire would have in the years to come. As we set out the stage today, first I want to look at language. If we need, you take missionaries for centuries, when they've gone to a land, one of the first things they had to do was learn a language. They couldn't really even minister until they learned the language. Now, missionaries will go to a land and learn the language while they minister, because they have the benefit of English being a common language. Back here, as we roll from the Old Testament to the New Testament, when Christ came, he was a Jew speaking mostly Greek, and everybody around him completely understood him. It wasn't a case of it being a broken language or a second language. This was a primary language. And so the New Testament, written almost entirely in Greek, when the fullness of the time was come. God sent his Son at a time when the message could come, and this isn't a 100% true statement, but you'll understand. Every breathing person could understand the message. It wasn't something that was hidden away and nobody knew what was being said. Everybody could understand it. And as it was penned, people could read it. They were not all a bunch of illiterates. And they understood their language and they could understand the Greek language, they could understand it. But even if they couldn't read it, guess what? Somebody could read it and preach it, teach it. And so you have that. So the Greek language helps, the Greek Empire sets the stage for the coming of the Messiah by providing a common language, a language that everybody could understand. Think of how valuable that was, how important that was, how much that sets the stage for the Messiah to come and people to be able to hear and understand the message of the Messiah. And that's, jump ahead 35 years, give or take, to Pentecost. Remember at Pentecost? And people are able to hear the preaching in their own tongue. And how significant, because you had people that were traveling from all parts of the world for that Passover celebration. They maybe didn't understand the Greek language, but now they can hear the message. When Christ comes, the people where he was working, in a small country, this was a country where he was able to get from point A to point B by walking back and forth. He wasn't traveling across the breadth of the United States. So everybody there fully and completely understood the message because they understood the language. And so as we get into this, some things to understand when the fullness of the time was come. What does that mean? Well, you have a common language. How does that happen? Did that happen because of Alexander the Great? Or did that happen because God was setting the stage? God was making preparation for his Son to come. How about the Jewish nation? We talked about, he's coming to the Jews. In the last couple of units, what have we seen? The northern tribes dispersed, in a really big way dispersed, like there's not a record of them returning. The southern tribes taken to Babylon, and 70 years later being allowed to return, and they return in stages, but they return and settle the land of promise. They don't, during those 400 years that Pastor talked about a couple of weeks ago, you have the Maccabees who revolt. They don't have their own nation now, but we could call them a Jewish state within the Roman Empire. They're governed by Rome. Think of Pontius Pilate. He was the governor of the area. And yet they have their own king, right? King Herod. You're familiar with that name. So how can they have their own king if they are under the rule of the Roman governor? Because Rome allows them some independence to a degree to govern themselves as long as they don't go against Roman law or cause any kind of a problem. And so the Jewish nation, they have their own nationality, they have their own culture, they have their own customs, they have their own way of doing things, and as long as it doesn't interfere with Rome and Rome's rule, Rome's good with that. When it begins to interfere, then Rome interferes. And when Rome interferes with a big, heavy foot. And so you have at different times, they talk about, in the Gospels, it talks about the Romans, and we don't want to do that for fear of the Rome, and things like that. And you'll find that especially as Paul is traveling and writes of his travels. And so they have a common language, but they also have their own government. Not an independent country, but their own government within the Roman Empire. And how does this happen? This happens because God is at work behind the scenes, setting the stage, so that when his Son comes, his Son is able to come to a place where he is free to roam and preach and teach. And as he preaches and teaches, he's able to preach and teach in a language that all the people understand. So we've talked about the Greeks, we talked about the Jews. There was one other nation, I just mentioned it, that was somewhat important at this time, and that would be the Romans, the Roman Empire. Israel was a part of, under the control of the Roman Empire at this time. There's a lot happening. And some of the things that are important with that, if you study history, pay attention to it and remember what we study. We have a period called the Pax Romana, the 200-year time of essentially peace within the Roman Empire. Doesn't mean there are no fights. Look at the world today. Are there any major warfares taking place? Well, no, but you can go to different parts of the world and find what? They live in constant battle. So there's war taking place, it's just not big open conflict. Well, that's kind of what we had to 200-year period here with the Pax Romana. And what it does, that means that Jesus is able to travel from point A to point B, from hither to yon, relatively freely. We think of Jesus as he's talking, and we have the lesson of the Good Samaritan. What happens to the traveler in the story of the Good Samaritan? Well, he gets beaten and robbed. So it's not as if the time of the Roman peace meant that there was no conflict whatsoever. But the interesting part of the story, while he is beaten and left for dead, he is passed by or encountered 3 other travelers who obviously felt that they were at peace enough to travel on the same road. It wasn't as if they had to carry armed guards and a Roman military escort everywhere they went. That's important because Jesus and the apostles are able to travel throughout Judea. They're able to travel and preach and teach. As Jesus is ascended into heaven and we move into the what we often call the church age as the apostles and then Paul, as they travel through the empire, they're able to travel pretty much freely. Sometimes Paul traveled freely in shackles, but sometimes that was his own doing too. That was his method to get to Rome. But they're able to travel freely. Why is that? Because we had this period of relative peace in the empire. Part of that, during this time period of relative peace, in order to move the army more quickly from place to place and to encourage trade from place to place, guess what the Romans built as they settled their empires? They built roads, which aided in travel. All of that aided in the delivery of goods from place to place. They provided a system of mail delivery. Much of the New Testament is epistles. What were the epistles? They were letters written to churches. How did they get from the apostle to the churches? I mean, all of that is happening behind the scenes, and yet it's setting the stage. So when we look at Galatians 4:4, that statement, but when the fullness of the time was come, that's a really weighty statement. There's a lot happening there that should help us to get a better understanding and a better appreciation for the work of God that's taking place here as the New Testament gets started up. So that next week when we have our lesson, the Messiah is come, guess what? There's a lot that has happened during that 400 years that you looked at 2 weeks ago to set the stage so that when the curtain comes up on the New Testament, the world is ready for what's about to happen. Now, does everybody understand what's happening? Nope. Does everybody get the message immediately? Nope. Does everybody that gets the message accept the message? We could go to John 1 and see the answer to that, right? He came into his own, and his own received him not. The people that were right there receiving the message didn't always accept it. But there were many who did. And so the stage is being set. They have the ability to travel, to live, to deliver mail and messages from place to place. Now think about the religious world at that time. They have a common language. There is a sense of peace throughout the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire is much larger than the Greek Empire ever dreamed of being. They have the roads and the systems to get mail and messages from place to place. Think about religions. Religions typically are cultural. And so you have the Jewish religion, and you've got the high priests and the Sanhedrin and the people that help to deal with that. And you have the Pharisees who are very much influential within. And yet the Romans, they've got their own religions. There are still Greek gods at play. Now, many of the Greek gods and the Roman gods are fairly similar. In fact, some of them are, if I say, same god, different name. And if you study Greek and Roman mythology, you'll encounter many of those. So there are lots of gods, but there's still only one true God. And that one true God wants to break through the darkness and shed the light of Jesus Christ. How does he do that? He does that in large part through the writing, the delivery of a message that we call the New Testament. And the New Testament is written, and it's not just hoarded. Over the last couple of units, how many times did we see, 2 or 3, that they were cleansing the temple, restoring the temple, and found a copy of the scrolls of the law? It was like, whoa, hey, look what we found. We thought this was lost forever. And you know what? It was right where it should have been. Now the message is coming, and the message is being given and delivered, and it's going to churches. There's a letter to a church that Paul wrote that we don't have a copy of necessarily, but we know it was written because he talked about it in a couple of different places, the letter to the church at Laodicea. Not everything that Paul wrote was inspired, but everything that Paul wrote to these churches would have been important. And in the letters, one thing he says is, hey, I sent a letter to this church, and I want you to get that letter and share it with your people too. Or he says to the Ephesians, I want you to share this letter with the church at. The messages would be delivered. So we have the religions of the world. Now Paul, as he travels, he comes to Athens, and he comes to Mars Hill, and what does he say? You've got all these gods that do nothing. And I want to introduce you to one more, who is the one and the true God. And so the religions of the world at the time provide nothing but darkness. And yet through that darkness, God is going to show the light of Jesus Christ. It's important that we understand. People tend to take their religions. Let me back up. In previous generations, people tended to take their religions very seriously. In our current generation, I'm not sure that our young kids would often ascribe to any kind of religion. They've grown up in a land that says that religion is unnecessary. And their religion is to worship a God called themselves, the God they see in the mirror when they wake up in the morning. Not terribly unlike other generations, but to a greater extreme. But typically, people take their religions very seriously. And so when Paul comes in to preach and teach Jesus Christ, he is not always received with joy and thanksgiving. In fact, what do we find? Paul often left town in a hail of stones, right? If not that way, he left town under lock and key. As he was, how did he find his audience with Agrippa? When Agrippa said, "Oh, I'm almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian." Well, Paul was not there. He didn't make an appointment and say, "Hey, I'd like to come and see you. Could I meet you on the 31st at 11 o'clock?" No. He was taken in under military escort. If you remember, he had been jailed because he had been in Jerusalem, and some of his traveling companions didn't quite fit the mode. They weren't circumcised Jews, and that did not go over well, and there was a riot, and they pulled him out of the riot. They pulled him out of the riot and put him where? In jail. And he appealed to the emperor because he was a Roman citizen and had the right to do that. Well, his appeal, you could appeal right now to the president, and guess what? Ain't gonna happen. Because he was a Roman citizen, when he made that appeal, guess what? It was going to happen. because it was a different world, and it was a world that was governed by the Roman Empire, and there were certain laws when the fullness of the time was come. Paul had a plan. I want to get to Rome. And that wouldn't have happened 200 years earlier. The time was right. And so the religions of the world, all these gods, but only one true God, and everything is coming together so that the message of that one true God can be freely delivered. Think about the New Testament itself. When we think of the Old Testament, we start right out with the books of the law. When we come into the New Testament, we start right out with the Gospels. And so we've got the 4 Gospels, or we could say we start out with 5 historical books. We've got the Gospels plus the book of Acts that give us, if you will, a historical narrative of that time period. And then it's the epistles or the letters after that. And we end with one book of prophecy. When we think of the letters that are written, the dominant author would have been the Apostle Paul. But there were others as well. Peter, James, and John, as you just come to the end there. But you've got Jude. And then there's always the discussion of Hebrews as to who wrote Hebrews. Many would say it was Paul. Some would say perhaps Barnabas. There's no definitive on that. But you've got the letters written. So as we look at the composition of the New Testament, you've got the historical books, the Gospels and the book of Acts. And then you've got the letters, the Pauline epistles, the others at the end there. And then you've got the book of the prophecy, the revelation of Jesus Christ through the hand of John. When we look at those, the historical books, particularly the verse 4, the Gospels, they are focused entirely upon the birth, the life, the death, the resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ. And they each look at Jesus Christ in a slightly different manner. One looks at Jesus as the king, one looks at Jesus as the servant. One looks at him as the Son of God, the other looks at him as the Son of Man. And through those 4, from 4 different perspectives, we get a more complete picture of Jesus Christ. When I was in college, I had one of my college classes, Bible classes, was the life of Christ. And the textbook we used was called, The Life of Christ in Stereo. And it was basically looking at the life of Christ through the lens of all 4 Gospels, kind of pulling it together, because they each looked at him from a slightly different perspective. And perspective makes a difference. Think of your particular background. Your background affects the way you see the world around you. You will see the exact same world slightly differently than the person seated next to you or across the auditorium, because your background, your perspective. And so perspective makes a difference. And the Gospels, each written from a slightly different perspective, help to give us a more full image or picture of Jesus Christ. Even to the point, look at the way the Gospels start. The book of Matthew starts out giving a lineage or a genealogy of Jesus Christ. Mark doesn't. Mark starts right out, he's an adult starting his ministry. Why the big difference? Well, the biggest difference is because Mark sees him as a servant, and not to be crass, but who cares about the lineage of the servant? It's not important. Matthew sees him as the king of the Jews. The lineage of the king is always important. And so you've got a different perspective, different way in which it was written. John looks at him as the Son of God. And so it starts right out with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of man. The light shineth in darkness, and darkness comprehended it not. John starts right out. Jesus Christ is God. Luke, what was Luke's profession? Luke was a doctor. He looks at Jesus Christ not as the Son of God, but as the Son of Man. And there's so much there within the beginnings of the book of Luke that show, well, what do we find in the beginning of the book? We find our traditional Christmas story, right? Because the doctor showing how Jesus Christ, the Son of God, came and became a man. And so all this is accomplished because God used 4 different people from 4 different backgrounds to write the story, singular, the story of Jesus Christ. And it all happens during this time, but when the fullness of the time was come. Why did Jesus, here's the one, where did the Magi come from? Oh, they came from the east. Boston maybe, I don't know. They came from the east. How long did it take to get there? We know that when they came, that Jesus was not in the stable at that point. He was in a house. But we don't have a lot more detail than that. We know that when Herod got really nervous, he had the little boys killed. How old were the little boys that were killed? They were 2 and under. So did it take them 2 years to get there, or did they start traveling before that? There's a lot of questions. What we do know is that they got there exactly when they were supposed to. They weren't late. They weren't early. They got there when they were supposed to, because God works on His timetable. But when the fullness of the time was come. And when the fullness of the time was come, what did God do? God sent forth His Son. Not anybody. What did John 3:16 tell us? For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. And so that John 3:16 Son is the exact same Son that we find here in Galatians 4:4. Made of a woman. Interesting statement. Because one of the things that we find as we get into the Gospels is that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin. And just one quick little statement here. But then it says, made under the law. He was born a Jew to redeem them that were under the law. Interesting statement, because Paul proclaimed himself to be the prophet to the, or apostle to the Gentiles. And he was very adamant that the Gentiles were not under the law. And yet, one of the things, and we'll see this next week when we get started into the new unit, is that the purpose of the law was not for redemption. The purpose of the law was to show us our need for redemption. And so while Jesus came to the Jews, the message was to all, because the law shows all of us that we come short, that we fall short of God's intention, that we fall short of God's plan, that we fall short of God's desire and will for us. To redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. And so the fullness of the time was come. All this, and again, this is a quick 40-minute history lesson to set the stage for the New Testament. There's so much that's happening here. We've got a common language. We've got a common government that allowed free travel. We've got a road system that allowed ease of travel. We've got the common language. We've got religions and gods aplenty. And so the preaching of a different God was not uncommon, but the preaching of a one true God grabbed the attention of people. Sometimes it grabbed the attention of people, and again, they followed it up with stones. Sometimes it grabbed the attention of people and they said, hey, tell us more. We want to hear more about this. And so there's a lot happening here before we start into Matthew chapter 1. And next week, as we get started into the new unit titled the Messiah has come. The next week is we can trust the New Testament, but it's not giving the background so much as it is, if you want to say, the apologetic side. And today, I'm like, there's a lot that sets the stage for what we see and what we find here. One of the statements, and it was probably in the lesson that Pastor had, I know it was mentioned last week, you have these 400 silent years. Is God really silent during that time? No, there's just nothing recorded of that time. We mentioned it last week, just again, we looked at the apologetics looking back. Daniel, in his prophecy, talked of the empires, and one of those empires was completely within those 400 silent years. So God didn't ignore it. His plan was into the Old Testament, when the fullness of the time has come, I'll send forth my son, and there was a gap there. But that doesn't mean there's nothing happening. God is setting the stage so that when the Messiah comes, he can come in a time when the vast majority of the known world at that time is able to hear the message, understand the message, and has the opportunity to receive the message. And that's kind of the introduction to the New Testament. And again, next week we'll have the Messiah come, and then we'll look at, okay, how do we know we can trust it? A little bit more on the apologetics side. But today I was like, to introduce the New Testament gives us a better understanding, a better appreciation. It's not simply, hey, these guys started writing about the message, and God didn't say, oh, hey, today feels like it might be a good day. God had a plan all along. And God was going to work that plan. And just like today, we mentioned, just like today, when is Christ going to come back? And we can say, as John did, even so, come quickly, Lord Jesus. He will come when God dictates. He will not be early. He will not be late. The Messiah came the first time at just the right time, and the Messiah will come the next time at just the right time. In the New Testament, we've to really appreciate it, it's got to be more than simply black words on a white page. We've got to understand this was a real event taking place in a real world with people dealing with the same real world problems that we have. Some of us are all up in arms about government. You know what? So were the Jews. Some of us are all trying to figure what's going to happen with the economy. You know what? So were the Jews. Some of us get all up in arms about taxes. Well, just go find a fish and pull a gold coin out. Oh, I mean, the Jews were concerned about taxes. I mean, the things that we are concerned about, so were they. And yet, when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law. God sent his Son at just the right time so that the message could come, and we can have the benefit of that written message, that preached message, even today in 2021. And so, as we get started into the new unit, looking at the Messiah, there's a lot taking place to set the stage. And once that curtain goes up, man, you have to be fully focused and paying attention, because there are things happening all over the stage of the world at that point. We've got angels. We've got shepherds. We've got a man and a woman and a donkey sitting in a stable. We've got wise men. We've got Herod. Nice guy that he is. We've got the Pharisees. I mean, think about all that's taking place in the entire cast of characters. And yet there's one that rises preeminent above them all. And that's the Messiah, the Son of God, Jesus Christ. And God sent him at exactly the moment that he intended to. Father, we thank you for your goodness and graciousness to us. Father, thank you